Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lee St. James, and I am the Managing Director of the Urban Robotics Foundation. And I invite you to sit back and enjoy the conversation for the next 20 or 30 minutes. We're going to hear from Bern Grush, our Executive Director, and our guest speaker today. I'm going to start with a quick introduction to Bern and myself. So Bern is the Executive Director of the Urban Robotics Foundation. He has over 20 years of experience in writing standards related to parking, road pricing, and autonomous vehicles. And he is the global lead for drafting the international standard ISO 4448, which is the foundational document that led to the creation of the Urban Robotics Foundation. He's an author, speaker, and thought leader, and has a Bachelor of Science in Human Factors Psychology and a Master's in Systems Design Engineering. I have over 20 years of market research, communications, and consulting experience, and I also have UI UX expertise in robot app development. I joined the Urban Robotics Foundation and move on to our next slide, which is to welcome our guest speaker, Fred Young, who's a senior consultant at Parametrix. Parametrix is a full-service engineering, planning, and environmental solutions company with headquarters in Seattle, Washington. And we're delighted to have Fred here today. He specializes in public projects that enhance the livability of communities. His experience includes active transportation plans for cities, regions, and states, and complete streets and access to transit. He collaborates with designers, engineers, and planners to develop cost-effective solutions that maximize public benefit. And his work experience spans projects across the United States and in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and China. We are delighted to have Parametrix as a member of the Urban Robotics Foundation, and we look forward to Fred's presentation today. Before we hear from Fred, I am going to quickly cover a short introduction to what are public area mobile robots, which is the focus of the Urban Robotics Foundation. There is tremendous overlap with the work of active transportation and micromobility solutions. So we want to clarify what that is. I'm going to give you a short introduction to the Urban Robotics Foundation, and we'll hear from Fred. And then Bern is going to facilitate a bit of a Q&A and lead a discussion with Fred. And you're welcome to enter your questions at any time in the chat. And then if time permits at the end, I can tell you a little bit more about the ISO 4448 and our latest project, which are the municipal guides to public area mobile robots. So with that, I am going to move into what is a public area mobile robot. The public area mobile robots are ground-based, so they have wheels or legs. They are not in the air. They are unmanned, sometimes teleoperated, but really it's about the use cases. So where they are operating in public pedestrianized spaces is where our deployment standard comes in. So it could be on walkways, sidewalks, shoulders of the road, but also in public buildings. So hospitals, malls, airports, zoos, things like that. And then the use cases or the tasks that they're performing helps to define what is a public area mobile robot. What they are not, or what's out of scope for our work, is really anything to do with industrial or manufacturing robots, warehouse robots, aerial drones, and then importantly for this discussion today, electric scooters and e-bikes. So there are overlaps, but it is not there. So we can learn from the experience that cities have had with electric scooters and e-bikes, but that is not what our work entails at the Urban Robotics Foundation. The type of challenges that we deal with are very different in terms of the unstructured environment that public area mobile robots operate in. We have an example here from a video. We just have some examples where we have a teleoperated robot that got stuck. Another robot came to assist it. That didn't work. So then a total bystander pedestrian came to try to help and figure it out. So it required a couple of people to help, and then they ended up leaving it, literally blocking the wheelchair ramp. And then finally, an employee from the company came to take away the disabled robot. After this, the robot that was still working went in to cross the intersection, and you see that there's like a driver error, and that the driver comes in and blocks the crosswalk. And there's also, you can see in the corner here, a car coming to block. So the robot can't really safely go back either. So what does it do? It goes out into the active lane and potentially creating quite a safety hazard. And if the driver hasn't seen the robot, that, creates a potential accident situation. So these are the challenges and the types of issues that we're dealing with the ISO. We also have a real accessibility focus in our work. And so this is a photograph of an elderly person with a condition called kyphosis. And basically, our questions are really to address the issue of like, will a public area mobile robot alarm her? And will it block her path? How can we prepare and set guidelines and standards so that the robot doesn't do those things? But then also, can it be of benefit? So could it maybe deliver groceries to her, or could it follow her and carry her bags for her, and maybe in some way protect her? So there are pros and cons, and we're really trying to examine all of these areas as we move forward. So the Urban Robotics Foundation at Burns initiative was founded in October 2021. And really it's about working at the intersection of urban space, accessibility, and mobile robots. Together with a working group from the International Standards Organization, we are drafting the International Standard 4448. It has 16 parts and will be formally published by the ISO. We anticipate fully by the end of 2026, the first edition. We are now in the process of writing and preparing to publish municipal readiness guidebooks, which are scheduled to be launched in early January. And we're very eager to bring those to fruition and encourage people to consider sponsorship. So please talk to me after this webinar if you're interested in that. We also deliver workshops, provide advisory services. And as I think I mentioned at the beginning, we are global, we are a nonprofit, and we are member supported. Our goals are to strengthen the stakeholder readiness. So not just cities, but all the different members that we bring together: robotics companies, technology companies, urban planners, transportation planners, smart city operators, accessibility advocates. Anyway, a full range, and we can talk about those later. But really our goals are to create well-constructed standards and consistent governance with standards-based design, which we believe will lead to greater accessibility and safety for all, higher acceptance, which is a very important and a significant barrier right now to the adoption of these devices, and ultimately to better livability and better cities. So with that as an introduction, I am going to hand it over now to Fred Young, our guest speaker, and I'll be monitoring the chat during his presentation and when he and Bern begin their discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand it over to Fred.
Great. Thanks, Lee. So thanks again for having me. When we first, embarked on this starting this conversation a few months ago, I was a bit confused. Like, why do you want me to talk about robots? I know nothing about robots, but what I do know is how to get people, or how to plan and design our cities to be safe for people walking and riding bikes. And I think as I've come to know the work that Lee and Bern are doing, it's clear that there's an intersect there, right? So these things are coming into our world, and we as humans need to figure out how to coexist and design cities that are safe for everybody and efficient. So I'm going to go through my thought process as I've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of thinking about my work, and thinking about what the future might be for for how to incorporate these PMRs into our world. So I'm going to go through my thought process. I have some ideas about maybe how we can start thinking about planning for these devices, and some challenges that are definitely out there. I think Lee has covered a few of them, and then I think Bern and I are going to jump into a conversation about what this means for the future. So I do a lot of planning for cities and communities and thinking about how to get people moving around in them. And one of the things, I'm sure a lot of people have already seen this or heard of this mobility pyramid, where we think about, it's a construct to think about how to prioritize different modes in our public realm. And walking, humans walking is really the primary thing that takes precedence over everything else. And then thinking about micromobility, shared mobility options, and then moving into private vehicles are the least priority if we were thinking about a sustainable, efficient transportation system. And that's really become the model in recent decade or more of how to think about cities in North America. Europe has been thinking along these lines a lot longer than we have, but this is where we are today. So none of this considers a PMR. So where does that fit in? I don't really know. So let's do some exploration here. So if you just look at the footprint that different modes take in the urban environment, a pedestrian is about half a square meter or so. A PMR is about a half a square meter. So it kind of takes up the similar space requirement. However, I would argue that a person and a PMR are fundamentally different things. Person is able-bodied being that goes about its life. It has a whole thing going on, a multidimensional way it interacts with the world. PMRs are really focused on delivering things or doing some sort of service. So they're really kind of monodimensional. And I don't think it's really fair to equate the two. I think there's some similarities there in the space they require, but I think there's some fundamental differences. So let's keep thinking about this. In 2020, the International Transport Forum started thinking about how to classify all of these changing and new micromobility devices that are coming online. So scooters, all kinds of different e-bikes, e-assist bikes, different mobility devices into kind of small, lightweight vehicles. And so the way they've started to think about this is really sorting vehicles by weight, mass, and speed. And so thinking about that, where does a PMR fit into this? And it's really a slow speed vehicle that is, on the heavier side of what they're classifying. So more in tune with a like an electric wheelchair or a maybe an e-bike delivery vehicle or something like this. So this is another way to think about it. And when we are planning and implementing infrastructure, we start thinking about separating modes by vehicle weight and size. So you want to put motor vehicles separate from bicycles and pedestrians. So this is another way to start thinking about where these things fit into our built environment. Another interesting thing, I was doing some thinking about this, and the weight, the payload weight to vehicle weight for motor vehicles and PMRs is somewhat similar, which I think is kind of an interesting thing to think about. I don't know what this means, and I think maybe we can have a discussion about this later, but in an urban environment, moving people and things by big, heavy vehicles is not efficient. Does that equate to these small PMR devices? I don't know the answer to that, but the analogy there is something to keep in the back of our head and think about that. There may be different ways to use these, or maybe there's special ways that these get used in the built environment. So one key thing that PMRs are being used to explore is how to address that last mile of package delivery. And FedEx has been doing a phenomenal job in recent years thinking about how to solve that. They've realized that it's not efficient to use a big truck full of things, full of packages to drive around in a city and deliver them. That's just not an efficient way to go, especially in dense urban environments. So they've invested in a lot of different things to think about how to do that. A lot of electric assist bicycles, trikes, small vehicles, even electric carts that get pulled. And they've also done a lot of work thinking about robots and how can those support that. And I think I threw in this quote from Byrne, and we can talk about it later probably, but I think he's right. If this is an industry that needs to show that it can be viable, I think it has to scale up. There has to be a lot of deliveries per hour. And FedEx is in an industry, they're established, they deliver things all the time. They probably have that capacity, right? So they're probably closer than most in figuring this thing out. However, They powered down their robot delivery and they went all in on electric bikes. And they are expanding their fleet for human-powered electric assist vehicles. And part of that is efficiency. Um, and I think it's interesting to think, I've never seen anything about this, but that payload to vehicle weight ratio might come into play here because this guy on the right and his bike probably weigh about the same as the freight that I mean, this guy in the freight he's carrying probably weighs about the same as the vehicle he's that's going about the business, versus the robot isn't. So I think there could be some economics at play here that will be figured out in the future, but I think it maybe there's a bit of work that needs to be done before these come online. That said, I totally think they are coming, and I think it's just not as imminent as some people are thinking. But that said, how do we design and how do we think about our built environment to get ready for this? And I think this gives us a bigger window of time to prepare and start thinking about how to incorporate robots. So where are PMRs most likely to be feasible in the built environment? And I would argue that places where there's a high density of people. So these are customers, right? We need people to engage with these in commerce with these things, and then also places with a high density of destinations. And as we're thinking about that, that is, in my mind, where transit often happens. High capacity transit is in these really dense areas. And I do a lot of planning, thinking about how to get people to and from transit safely. And working within US federal guidelines of station access, half mile for walking, 3 miles for biking. Everything I've seen for robot delivery fits within that station area planning walk access shed. And another interesting thing about this in the United States, at least, and I think in a lot of places, people highly value walkable places. And are really seeking those out as places to live and be, and which is great. And I think that again, all of this is kind of coming together. So these are the types of environments where I think robots are going to be most useful. So some planning that I've done in that realm that I think could even be a surrogate for how to think about planning for PMRs in the built environment is bike share planning. So I've done quite a bit of that in over the last 8 to 10 years, I guess. And the list of characteristics on the left is what I think about when we're figuring out whether or not bike share is feasible. So destinations, is there a network to support this type of movement? Where do people want to go? How do they want to engage with the environment? And so we can create these heat maps that show where the most likely activity centers are going to be. That same process, maybe some different inputs, but that same process could be used to understand where PMRs are most feasible. Another aspect about bike share, and this we've known for a long time, is that bike share is most successful when there are safe, connected networks for people to ride bikes. That is a absolute truth. Cities that have great networks have good bike share if they've implemented it. Cities without great networks, their bike share systems don't do so well or even fail. And this has been backed up by data over the last decade in North America. And it's really a critical feature. And I think when we're thinking about PMRs, as some of those examples that Lee showed at the beginning, those networks need to be complete. These little devices need to be able to move throughout the built environment safely and efficiently. Otherwise, they can't do their job. So there's some tangents or some parallels here that we're talking about. Another thing to think about is accessibility. So we can, and this is every city in North America is having challenges with this, but this is my city in Seattle. There's an organization that's doing mapping missing sidewalks, obstacles, and curb ramps within the city. And you can see the heat maps on the right. These challenges are everywhere. They're big sections of the city without sidewalks and with obstacles blocking sidewalks. And then maybe you get to the curb and there's no way to get down if you're using a assistive mobility device. So these are challenges not only for humans moving around that have mobility challenges, but also PMRs will have the same exact mobility challenges. On the left, there's a map, access map that we have in Seattle. It shows you can plot your course. I want to go from here to here, and it will provide with some parameters an accessible route. So if you're in a wheelchair, you can figure out where you need to go. And quite often it is not a direct route. It is out of direction. So there's some equity issues here that we need to think about for humans moving around, let alone robots. And I included this quote from Judith Heumann. If you don't know her work, you should know it. She's kind of a spectacular career that's really done a lot of work in accessibility design and really shaped our cities over the last decades. She recently passed away, but she's got a memoir out there. Read it. It's phenomenal. I read it a couple of weeks ago. So once we have all of this data, we can then start analyzing our networks. And this is a analysis that I do quite often. This is called level of traffic stress, and you can run this analysis for bicycle networks or pedestrian networks. On the far left, we can look at data, and it can tell us if the route has a high stress for people biking or walking, or low stress, and whether or not it's connected. So generally on the right, or sorry, on the far left, green is relatively low stress, red is high stress. We can take that network data and then think about where the demand is in the middle there, and where people want to go. Where are the activity centers? Where do people live? Where do they work? Where do they want to go? And then using that, we can do a simple prioritization process and say, hey, we need to connect these areas because that's where people are wanting to travel. This exact same process could be used to understand networks as they relate to PMRs. Very simple, simple thought process to get there. I have a whole set of colleagues who are doing some really innovative, interesting work with cameras, existing traffic cameras that are in cities now, and they work with a software provider who can then analyze that video feed. And one thing that we're doing is working with a couple of cities to think about where there are safety issues at those intersections. So the middle map, or the middle image here, shows is a heat map, and it shows where there are near misses between pedestrians and drivers. This same idea could be applied to near misses between anyone and a PMR, and find out where PMRs might be having challenges navigating. And then what we're doing with this, what we will be doing with this type of analysis, is then targeting where to make intersection improvements instead of holistically improving the intersection, because maybe it really has some dangerous spots in some areas. We can just really focus our resources to improve what's going on there. Same kind of thing could be applied to PMRs. So once we've done all that analysis, then we can really dig into and look at the very rich at this point in time set of design guidance that exists for implementing pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. Just two simple examples here. Seattle has this really great right-of-way design manual that is focused on everything in the public right-of-way. And this was years in development. And I just threw in here the pedestrian sidewalk zone, and you can see the different street types down on the left side of that column, all of the different standards for widths of the different types of, or different parts of the sidewalk. All of this was created probably without the thought that PMRs would be potentially coming. So these design standards don't yet include the idea that, hey, these sidewalks are thought about for maximum capacity and efficiency of people walking, but not yet thought about what happens if we throw in some PMRs running around. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if anybody does, but that's something that needs to be considered. Same thing for bicycle infrastructure. We've been thinking about bike infrastructure for more recently, more in recent years, cargo bikes that are a little bit bigger. How do PMRs fit in there? Well, bikes move at a different speed than PMRs. So is there some thought there that needs to happen? Absolutely. I don't know what that answer is yet. I would love to think about it at some point, but these are challenges that exist. Our existing design guidance doesn't yet think about PMRs, and it absolutely needs to. So, but streets, we've been innovating streets for thousands of years, and there's no reason we can't continue to do that. Simple graphic on the left shows a transition that we do all the time for streets, thinking about how to get in more efficient transit, more efficient bike lanes, how to move people more efficiently along our streets. And so reallocating street space to accommodate a variety of modes. In New York City, they have the fantastic problem of congested bike lanes. What an awful thing to have, right? So they are thinking about, hey, how do we further reallocate street space? And they're looking at really wide bike lanes. So just really expanding it. Which is a great problem to have. And they're working through that now. This is just a transition or transformation that they're exploring on Second Ave on the right side of before and after. Another thing that really needs to be considered tonight is curb space management. So this is a new thing, relatively new thing that cities are really getting on board with. Thinking about how to manage the space that's at the edge of the streets, because that's where everything needs to happen, right? That's where the transitions happen from moving in a vehicle to moving on a sidewalk and those interactions. So Minneapolis has mapped out all of the different types of curb uses that it manages. They have a phenomenal database that's digitized, and they can manage that at a very micro level. It's pretty spectacular. And then once you've got that, then you can start thinking about how to prioritize curb space use based on a number of things, based on the land use context, and then based on what it's being used for, whether it's used for commerce, whether it's used for benefit of people, or stormwater, or transit, what have you. So there are different things. It's another thing to manage in our public right away. We're increasingly getting requests to think about mobility hubs, and there's absolutely an opportunity here for PMRs to be incorporated. So a mobility hub is really where that rich ecosystem of transit and transportation options come together, and mixed in with maybe commercial, residential, all kinds of things coming together in a very small space, and making it efficient and easy to navigate. And there could be opportunities for PMRs to be integrated into this type of evolving land use. And I just want to end with this. The reason we build cities and live in cities is because we want to be close to people, and they're active places, and we don't want to lose that. That activity is really why we exist, right? So whatever PMRs come into this environment, we want to make sure that we don't lose what we've got. And I think I'm going to end there. I don't know if I went over, but pass it back to Lee. And should I stop sharing?
Thank you so much, Fred. Yeah, that would be awesome. And we'll get Bern and you to begin your discussion at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Please feel free in our audience to turn on your camera if you wish, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So we do have a question from Jai, and I'll just mention it now, and then Bern, you and Fred can begin either answering this question or whatever you had already planned. But Jai's question is, what is your observation on the level of public engagement and whether social trust is being focused on relating to PMRs in contrast to the negative sentiment around autonomous vehicles?
So, Lee, I'm going to suggest that we take that question up after a short conversation between Fred and I. And Fred, you and I, we could talk for 6 hours about what you've just done. You've hit on almost, I'm not gonna say all the things that you could have hit on, but you've hit on so many major things. And you're on mute. But what I would like, I'd just like to mention a couple things about what you spoke about. These are just very brief comments. First of all, the business model of delivery as the kinds of PMRs that you showed, which require a receiver to be present to take the package, that's a failure of the business model of these because it limits what they can do. And that's not FedEx's business to go and wait for you to take your lunch. And so that's why they pulled that back. That's me saying that. They have not said why they pulled back, but it's obvious that business model doesn't work for them.
Yep.
Now, I will say that there's a lot of things missing. The locker systems, which you showed in the second last slide, that helps. You didn't show PMRs that are with ambulatory, with legs and so on. So there's the PMRs that we're seeing now, they're like the Model T of what we're going to see. And so you're very far thinking in what you're thinking. And I agree with all of your thinking. And then as soon as you finish that thinking, it's all going to change.
I know.
So you're going to be at this for a long time. One thing I wanted to say. And I think probably the most important thing that you said, and that's what I really want to talk about today. The hell version of this is that PMRs compete and they get banned and they can only be used in some places, and there's just always this conflict, as there is now something of a conflict between cars and bikes or cars and pedestrians and so on. We're just going to have another conflict. This time, the conflict between bikes and PMRs and walking and PMR. And by the way, PMRs and cars, because PMRs share the intersection.
Yep.
So if we find a way, and this is my first question to you, is what do you think is, and how to go about gaining the opportunity of collaborating so that one of the ideas you spoke about was New York making wider lanes for bicycles. If we make wider spaces for all forms of small vehicle and pedestrian and cycling and so forth, I understand we can't afford to put in a separate lane for PMR, separate lane for everything. We need to share space somehow. Already in my city, in Toronto, we don't have sufficient bike lanes, and many cyclists are using many sidewalks in Toronto. That's not even legal, but it's done because we're just not prepared for it. And how do you, so my question is, what do you think we can do to start creating a collaboration amongst pedestrians, bicycles, PMRs, e-bikes, all this, to gain space for active transportation? You and I know it has to come from cars, but that's like, let's make the conflict about cars and active and not make the conflict about robots and pedestrians. What's your thought?
I agree. And I think the opportunity is thinking about how we efficiently move people and goods in our communities. And that's really what cities are about, right? It's that efficiency. And if you start there and then think about what an sustainable transportation system looks like and what an equitable transportation system looks like. So we need to provide for everybody, all humans, we all need to move around. Cars don't make sense. It's not, if you take your emotion, we're Americans, or a lot of us are Americans. Cars are just inbred into how we think about moving around in our world, right? And that's just kind of how we're hardwired. But if you remove that emotion out of your thinking and just look at the pure logic of it from an efficiency standpoint, it doesn't make sense in most dense urban environments. PMRs could start taking some of that load off vehicles. Absolutely. I don't know what that looks like. Like you said, it's going to evolve really quickly over the next decades. And that's an opportunity that I see. And I don't know what that looks like, but thinking about when I work with cities on planning of corridors and planning of networks, there are often a lot of times to find common goals between modes. And that's really what needs to happen with this, is thinking about as we are making streets more accessible for people using assistive mobility devices, they will be more accessible for robots. They'll be more accessible for literally everybody. So if we really find that baseline commonalities that are needed, I think that's how we're going to build cities that are more inclusive and more accessible to everybody, including these PMRs. So I think that's really how I start thinking about things, is where are the common goals, and then move on from there.
I would love to see, and we're going to include this in our guidebooks as well, but we need kind of an understanding of what these common goals are as an isolated chapter in the book that we're writing, or maybe a paper that I invite you to consider co-authoring a paper, for example. We need to have kind of like a dictionary of common goals, or a guideline of common goals. I'm sure there's only 6 or 8 or 12. It's something that it doesn't take a whole book to write, but we have to enumerate those, because I think not everybody automatically understands all of them. Now, I want to ask you another thing. Is my observation, and this is just my local, I'm not a planner, so I have a limited observation. I find many circumstances that I believe that are not up to accessibility standards. And when I say many, it's not isolated 2 or 3 places. I've been to cities where there's whole tracts that are not touched with respect to the appropriate width, the appropriate organization, or the appropriate ramps and all that sort of thing. What is your, I mean, how far away do you think we are, and what will it take us to catch up just with ADA? Because we're about to say, I'm about to add that ADA is not enough.
Right.
And you already recognize that ADA is not enough. So we're not caught up with ADA, and now we want to add more. So I don't want to use the word crisis, but I think there's a serious concern here for all of our cities.
Oh, totally. I mean, so ADA was passed in 1990. That's 33 years ago. And there isn't a city in the US that's compliant in any way. My city has big sections of the city that does not have sidewalks. So people are walking or rolling in the same space that is poorly designed for drivers, to be honest, for cars even. So that's not accessible. We're not meeting that. There are curb ramps. The city I live in, there's a lawsuit a number of years ago, and they are required to spend a significant amount of their budget on installing ADA accessible ramps, curb ramps, and which is, it's unfortunate it came down to a lawsuit, but that is sucking up a huge amount of budget, and it's going to be, I can't remember, hundreds of years before we get there. And so the timelines of these things, city building takes a long time. Robot evolution takes a very short time, we're finding. So I think your question is, how do we rectify that? And I don't have a good answer to it, other than we need to really think about cities. I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I'm really pro density and pro transit, and focusing investment around that, and really thinking about how to make cities more livable, where we don't have to depend on big vehicles to inefficiently move us around. And that's, I think, in doing that, I think a lot of these things start falling into place.
But I want to add in a couple of questions about if you could bring in your experience in Southeast Asia. And you've talked a little bit about how the U.S. is really sort of a car-focused society. But even the FedEx example that you showed had some really interesting types of vehicles that I had never seen before.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you can help us understand, and this is part of the work that we do at the Urban Robotics Foundation, what are some of the best practices you're seeing out there, and how can we start to raise the profile of some of these interesting, I don't know if it's cultural or societal options.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So I was living in Vietnam for a number of years, but working across the region. So I would have my mind was stretched. Let's say I was living in Saigon, and I would have meetings with Ho Chi Minh City DOT. And the next week I would have a meeting with Singapore Land Transport Authority, and those two places are 2-hour flight apart, and they couldn't be more different in their level of sophistication when it comes to transportation. So in Vietnam, motorcycles are king. And it's interesting to see mobility built around that and innovation, and people are really quick to think about how they can use the facilities and the means they have to do things. And I would see all kinds of delivery startups working, and it was a lot of motorcycle based, a lot of can carry things, a lot of just different ways of doing things. And that was like ground up innovation. In Singapore, very different. I think they are much more deliberate and careful and focused on how they do things. And they like collecting data, heavily collecting data on how things are working. And a number of different places I saw PMRs in operation there, which was fascinating to see. I wasn't working on that when I was there, but just seeing them in action was really interesting. And that the thing about Singapore is they're constantly innovating, they're constantly thinking, and as part of that, they're constantly iterating how they do things. So they're trying something, starting with a best practice, looking at it like, oh, that doesn't quite work here. Let's try it a little bit differently. So they're not stopping something because it fails. They're trying to figure out how to get around that failure and learn from it. And I think that's probably a big lesson is like, we need to try, learn, and then try again. Probably going forward is probably good. I don't know if that at all answered your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Let's take a look at, can you repeat Jai's question? Let's take a look at that.
In the chat, it says, what is your observation on the level of public engagement and whether social trust is being focused on relating to PMRs in contrast to the negative sentiment around autonomous vehicles? I'll start by saying that my observation generally is that there is not a lot of public engagement with public area mobile robots yet. I think that there are certain markets, so San Francisco, maybe a little bit more in Washington, DC, in terms of the North American market. Obviously, there are, Milton Keynes in the UK, and there are certain places, Madrid, Barcelona. I'm not sure what's happening in Denmark. We have a robotics company there that's actively doing a lot of property maintenance type activities there. But I think that we're still very, very early days around public engagement with public area mobile robots. I think that the autonomous vehicles are sexier, bigger, so many more billions of dollars have been invested in that industry. So I think that it also came with, high publicity when people were killed by autonomous vehicles. And so that's where the negative sentiment comes in. And there's not a lot of room for failure. As you just mentioned, Fred, when it comes to autonomous vehicles, like the fact that there have been, people, pedestrians and passengers killed creates, like a huge, like, oh, how on earth could that have happened? And it's just like, well, that's part of innovation that these things happen, right? But I don't have any other. I think the conversation on the autonomous or the negative the negative perception of AVs is something that I can't fully explain or understand at this point. Just I haven't done enough research myself. But Bern, you're more of an expert in that.
A lot of the negative sentiment around AVs is the negative news stories just carry more traction. There is negative sentiment, but it's not overwhelmingly so. There's a lot of positive sentiment as well. You don't usually hear as much of that. For PMRs, the proportion of the population that even thinks about them is much smaller. But of the ones that do think about it, the sentiment is generally positive, as in they're curious and they're cute and they they bring me lunch and so forth. Most people don't care about them, but there is a degree of negative sentiment. There's not zero negative sentiment. There is some, but the proportion of negative sentiment is less for PMRs than, if you want to look at that ratio, than it is for autonomous vehicles. That might change if there were larger fleets, if there were multiple fleets. Right now, you just have a single fleet of 8 or 10 8 or 10 vehicles in one location. It's not the same as having 200 robo-taxis in one city, and it's not the same as having multiple fleets from multiple companies. And we haven't experienced that yet. We haven't experienced a city with PMR fleets from 3 or 5 different companies. So that we haven't tried that yet. I think we're going to see the negative sentiment increase in the curves, but that's the projection.
I think from my perspective, to get at Jai's question, or an angle on Jai's question, is thinking about right now when we're moving through, walking down a street, we're engaging with people, and this is something I did often in Vietnam. I would sit on a corner and just watch the choreography of people. It was just fascinating. And so as we're walking through down a street, we don't even know it, but we're constantly negotiating with other people about who's occupying a certain amount of space at a certain time. And we're constantly doing that. And we know how to do that innately because we're human. We know how to communicate with each other in ways that we don't overtly know how to do. And that's going to be a friction point and a challenge when PMRs are out there, because this thing on the street, I don't know how to engage with it. I don't know what it's picking up from me. I don't know what it's doing. It's like a fire hydrant. It's there, right? But it moves. So that's going to be where that negativity comes in, is suddenly we have these things moving down the street and I don't know what I'm going to do with it. What do I do? How do I get out of its way? How do I coexist with this thing? And that needs to be solved.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. The standard actually addresses all those issues, but there is no way of knowing whether the standard is like solved 60% of it or 80% of it. And there's no guarantee that it will be followed, even if it does solve a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you talked earlier about the understanding how these things might move through space, and one of the things the standard does is it actually records close calls. You talked about close calls.
Yep.
It records close calls so that the software can be improved to reduce close calls. Close calls sound like they don't matter from the perspective of injury, but it matters tremendously with respect to your comfort as a pedestrian.
Yep. Because
you've walked down this block and you had 6 close calls. That is not okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That will create no one was hurt, but it will create enormous negative. And as soon as the PMR knocks your shopping bag out of your hand and spills your oranges on the ground, that's it for you.
All over.
You are finished now with these things. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah. I just want to add here, I'm just jumping ahead, Lee. One of the questions comes from Lorenzo is that we've been talking now for most of this about delivery, but there are many other kinds of PMRs. There's security PMRs that might be patrolling a neighborhood. There's PMRs that might be salting the sidewalk. This is the same thing. They're the same size, they're the same kilograms, same speeds, in the same space, and all the same issues. They just happen to be doing other things. So those are all important things. And so it's not, I just wanted to make sure that the audience knows it's not just about delivery. Well, that's kind of the predominant thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think around that, there are different ways to think about, I know Lee and Bern, we've talked about service robots that do things, clean or pick up trash or whatever out in the environment. And this gets back to the previous question about how to engage with these things out there. So just as an aside, the Downtown Seattle Association runs the Metropolitan Improvement District. So they contract with the city to maintain and clean streets within a pretty sizable portion of downtown Seattle. And their program employs, I think, 140-ish people, and they're outfitted with electric bikes and all the equipment they need to go out and do their thing. And they have a dispatcher to move around. And so this is a group of people that is engaging with the city in an interesting way. They're providing a service. They're also eyes on the street. So they're providing another service. So they're providing that kind of tangential security. They are engaging with visitors. Downtown Seattle gets a lot of out-of-town visitors, so they're helping people navigate. And then they're also, many of them were formerly homeless. So there's a program to give people jobs, train them how to have jobs, and move them through the cycle. They're also a bridge between people who are currently experiencing homeless and professional caregivers. So there's this really rich opportunity that isn't device focused. If we replace them with PMRs of some kind, that we've lost something. And I think that's my angle at this, is really there is a benefit to PMRs, but what are we losing when we think about that? And how do we not lose what makes our city so great?
I think a part of that is to really relate to them as augmenting people and
Yep.
being robot helpers and not just replacing people. I think that there is a fairly broad labor shortage, not just in the United States, but globally. And certainly with the demographic shifts that are coming, that we are looking for ways that technology can help do some tasks that we can't hire enough people to do. But I appreciate the multidimensional aspect of what you're talking about in terms of those roles. And I do look forward to the increasing capability of these devices and the technologies to take on some of those additional responsibilities and opportunities as well as they grow.
Yeah.
I'm seeing.
One of the classes of robots that fits with that, it's called a follow me robot. And when you showed that FedEx picture, one of the sub pictures had a person that was pulling a cart that you said it was electric, so that person could quite a heavy cart. Those now, and there's already been sort of concept designs as a follow me robot, so there's not like a physical handle. It follows you. Those can be actually set out in a train. So now one of the workers can have like 4 or 5 of them are electronically tethered in the concept, but there's still a person, there's still a job, and that person is whatever maintenance or whatever activity, including you spoke about tangential security and navigation. So the human can help with navigation, but the tangential security can come from cameras on the and so on. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm just saying these are all possibilities that that brings up. So.
Yeah. I also want to mention just in the chat that we have a note from Stefan. It's the Seattle Department of Transportation that PMR, this probably goes back to the conversation we're having about the negative attitudes towards autonomous vehicles, is that PMRs are also less dangerous due to their weight. So they are obviously lighter, and you talked a little bit about payload and things like that, Fred, in your presentation. And then Graham mentions another recent example in the news, New York Police Department robots for surveillance in subway stations. And yes, in fact, and another one of our members is doing a test in Peoria, Illinois with safety and surveillance robots as well. So that is coming to North America. They've been in China for quite some time now doing that type of use case or task. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? I don't know. I know, Bern, did you and Fred have any other things that you wanted to draw on? I can certainly, I have a couple more slides I can pull up if.
Yeah, why don't you pull up those other slides? I mean, Fred and I can talk a long time, but I want to make sure that our guests have a chance to ask questions as well.
Okay, great. I just want to clarify that we do have a range of members that join the Urban Robotics Foundation, and we invite you to find out more. Our key goals are to help you get prepared and anticipate the impact of public area mobile robots for your city or your organization or your business, to help to shape the international standards, which are being actively developed now, and to engage in strategic roundtables such as this to network and problem solve with other expert stakeholders. The draft technical standard that Bern is the global lead for has 4 major areas and 16 parts. Members get access to the draft parts, and we just actually reviewed parts 14 and 15 in our member workshop this past week on Tuesday, and the video is in the member resources portal. And then we are also developing the municipal guide to PMRs as a bridge between the sort of the technology, logistics, and operations side of things, which are part of the technical standard, and then the whole areas of governance, livability, and accessibility, which really contribute to urban confidence in these technologies. So those publications are in development as well, and will soon be available for a general audience. So we have an executive guide, a discovery guide, and a project guide. And if you're interested in finding out more, you can go to our sponsorship page on our website to find out more about those. And the project guidebook actually covers the 6 pillars of deployment for robots. So Fred has certainly brought up a range of very interesting challenges, and obviously most cities don't have that expertise all in one group. So we invite you to follow up with Parametrix if you're interested in getting some help to work through some of these things. And also the Urban Robotics Foundation is also helping with planning for deployment of these devices. And so that's really all I had. I do see there's something new in the chat while I was going. So that was just for Fred. Thank you for joining the conversation, everybody. And if there are any more questions, Bern and Fred and I will be here, but you're welcome to say goodbye, and thank you for joining us today. I will be sending out an email to everybody who registered with a link to the video, which will be on our new YouTube channel within a couple of days.